Awesome. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So, I want to break down exactly what it is that triggers attraction for people. And we're going to cover this in a number of different ways, but my favorite way to deal with it is actually with understanding brain chemistry. Because believe it or not, the emotion of love is a lie. There is actually no such thing as the emotion of love. Science has done studies and they've calculated what all the different emotions are that exist. There's happiness, there's sadness, there's anger, there's surprise, there's disgust, there's contempt, there's a whole bunch of ones, there's fear, but there is love. So every time you say, I've fallen in love, or I feel like I'm in love, or I have the emotion of love, with all due respect, as far as science is concerned, you're just wrong, right? That's not a thing. So it makes us question, what is love? How many of you in the back of your mind, by the way, just went, baby, don't hurt me? I totally did, I couldn't help it. So the funny thing about love is it becomes a lot easier if we remove intimacy. If we can remove the idea of physical, adult behavior in the bedroom, and instead we can focus on just the actual act of being in love, it becomes a lot easier for us to understand it. And this is what often happens when our hormones get involved and we start blurring desire with love. We're confusing two different things. You can desire something and not necessarily love it, right? So we can separate those. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the idea of horniness or physical attraction to one side, and we're just gonna focus on love and what it truly is. And if I had to explain what love was to you, I can find no better way of describing it than a chemical that is present in the brain known as oxytocin. And it's widely regarded that oxytocin is the love chemical. And of course, with all these things, there's gonna be people that disagree, right? They're gonna be like, yeah, whatever, there's no way that oxytocin is love, love is this, love is that, love is the other. But I'm gonna make a pretty good argument that love is oxytocin, and that when you want to experience love, you want to feel oxytocin. And I'm gonna make a good argument that when you're feeling oxytocin, that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else is feeling oxytocin. And this is where a lot of people get confused when it comes to love and crushes, and why we get so upset when you're like, I feel in love with you, and the other person doesn't like you, and you go, I don't understand, I feel it, why don't you feel it? And the reason is because the oxytocin is in your mind. It's not in the other person's mind, it's just in yours. And so we're gonna talk about what oxytocin is, we're gonna talk about what generates it, and then we'll talk about how you can trigger it in your own mind and how it can become triggered in somebody else's. While we can't guarantee to trigger it in somebody else's, it's inside their head, you can definitely help it be triggered and start to look for it and see if you can see it there. And you'll find that more often than not, when you are triggering oxytocin in somebody else and they're triggering oxytocin in you, the two of you will fall in love. Or, to make it really boring, there is mutual oxytocin being generated inside your brains. And I know it's not as fun to think of love that way, but I find it's much more accurate. And if we can think about this, then it becomes a lot easier to work out how to maintain a relationship or get a relationship or what have you. So, oxytocin. Oxytocin is one of the multiple chemicals that we have in the brain. There are essentially 5 that govern our moods. And while science knows a lot about emotion, we don't really know a lot about moods. Moods are actually something like a prolonged emotion over time. We don't really understand them fully, but the chemicals are definitely a factor. Each of the chemicals does something different. You have dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin, and cortisol. And what's fascinating about it is people seem to use them interchangeably. Someone will be like, oh, I was hanging out with my friend and I totally had some endorphins kick in. And I was like, really? You were in pain? And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, because endorphins are actually the natural painkiller that you're given when you work out in the gym and you hurt yourself. They're like, well, no, they were just making me laugh. And I was like, oh, you meant oxytocin. So each chemical is triggered via a different thing. And we're not going to go into all the different chemicals. We are really just going to focus on oxytocin, or the bonding chemical. This is the chemical that makes sure that you form friendships, that makes sure that you fall in love, that makes sure that you know the people that you're bonded with. Okay? Now, there are many different ways that oxytocin can get generated, but we're going to start off with the one that's only going to affect some of you in the room and not the rest of you, and that is the act of giving birth. Now, I have 4 children, I've got a 5th one on the way, and as a father of multiple children, I noticed something. I noticed that my partners fell in love with our children the minute they were born, and it took me a little bit longer. I loved the idea of being a dad. I was in love with this little child, but not in the same way that my partners were. However, As time went by, my love for them grew to the exact same amount. And that's because when a woman gives birth, in a typical healthy birth, the woman's body is flooded with oxytocin. They can measure this, they can monitor it, and they can see that's what happens. So the minute the love at first sight, it's really love at first oxytocin. So what happens is the baby, they see the baby and they feel the baby and they give birth and they're like, I love you. On top of that, how long has the mother been hugging the baby before the baby's born? And that'll be about 9 months. From the minute they start rubbing their belly, which is their own body, which they love, also generating oxytocin, they are falling in love with the creature that they are touching for so long. All of these things generate oxytocin, and it is typically why a mother falls madly in love with a child when they're first born. The father, however, has to generate oxytocin in a different way. He didn't experience the pregnancy in the same way. Now, there are some fathers that can trigger it. If you spend a lot of time hugging the pregnant woman, the belly, feeling the touching, you can build it up faster, and we'll talk about all the different ways that happens. But the reality is, most fathers experience the deep love at a later date. There's not much difference between the two. It's the same chemical. It's just about how long it takes to get generated. So, when we think about a situation about our own life, if you ever felt madly in love with somebody, but they didn't feel madly in love with you, that was typically because you had oxytocin, but they didn't. The best way to explain this is, I want you to raise your hand if you have a favorite pair of shoes. Raise your hand. I totally have a favorite pair of shoes. Awesome. You all have a favorite pair of shoes, except for the two women, which is hysterical right now. I just love that. The women in the room do not have a favorite pair of shoes. All the guys like, I totally have a favorite pair of shoes, dude. Great. So the funny thing about your favorite pair of shoes is you love those shoes. In many ways, if you have a favorite pair, you've actually bonded with those shoes. They mean something to you. If somebody stole those shoes, how would you feel? You raised your hand.
Not good.
Not good. You'd be upset about it, right? Like you stole my shoes. How would the shoes feel? They wouldn't. They don't care. That's because the shoes don't have any oxytocin. And this I found is the best way to describe what happens in a relationship. When you love someone, you have oxytocin for them, but they don't have it for you. So when they're stolen from you, they were never stolen from you. When they leave you, they never left you. There was nothing there from their perspective. They don't have oxytocin for you. You do. And the minute you start to understand this, relationships become so much easier. Instead, we kind of want to be a little bit guarded about how much oxytocin we allow ourselves to generate when we meet somebody. Instead, we want to make sure that we're monitoring to see if the oxytocin is going two ways. Am I generating oxytocin in them, or am I not? Because if I'm not generating oxytocin in them, I probably need to moderate how I interact with that person. If you've ever seen somebody becomes a crazed wild stalker, it's because they have generated oxytocin in their own mind without the other person even being present. Which sounds crazy, but I'll give you an example of just how that may happen. I want you to imagine that a random couple meet each other on a Saturday, and they have a wonderful time. They meet in a coffee shop, they end up going to dinner together, they go out, they have a wonderful night, and they have their first kiss. And that is it. And now they separate. And on Sunday, they text a couple of times about how great the night was, and they make a plan to meet the following Saturday. So we now have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Well, person A phones up their friend. You won't believe I had the most amazing night last night. Describes the night and says how great it was. They say they're so cool. They go and add them on all their social media so they can stay in touch. They then tell their mum that they met someone that was really, really cool and they couldn't believe it and they want to jinx things, but maybe, just maybe, this is who they've been looking for. Monday, they go to work, talk to their coworker, tell their coworker how great it was such a fun time. And we continue through the whole week, every day until we get to Friday, the day before Saturday, before the meetup. Now let's go to person B. Person B had a lovely night. The problem is person B kind of met somebody about a month earlier that they kind of had something with that wasn't really that great, but it wasn't terrible. And they didn't want to tell the new person because they really liked the new person, but also don't really want to break up with the old person. So on Sunday, when they couldn't meet up, they went to see the other person and hung out. And they made out with them too, and they didn't really enjoy it, and they decided they prefer person A. But they still kind of went with person B and didn't tell anyone about person A. They see all the social media requests and they're like, oh, that's really sweet, and they add them on anything. But then they get a little bit distracted by some work, and so they don't really think anything of it. Person A has sent them a couple of messages. Person B thinks they're so sweet but hasn't had time to respond. On Monday, person B is so busy with work, they forget to tell anyone about person A, but it was still nice and they respond to the messages from the day before. On Tuesday and Wednesday, they continue texting every so often, but every time they go to their computer, they're so happy because they see a whole bunch of messages from the other person that obviously really likes them. We come through to Saturday. They're now going to meet each other for the first time. There's been nothing negative happen on either part, and person B really does like person A. But person A is very excited because person A is packed with oxytocin. Now they meet and person A goes, it's so good to see you! Oh my God! And person B goes, huh? Oh, good to see you too! And we have a disconnect. And it's an oxytocin disconnect. Because the oxytocin is generated in your own brain. You make it, not them. And if you allow yourself to build up this oxytocin in your mind, it's going to make it very, very difficult for you to get a balance with the other person. Does this all make sense to you guys? What do you think about it so far? Is this good? Awesome. All right, so let's talk about the different ways to generate oxytocin, because there are essentially only 4. And each one escalates or scales up. So if I showed you a simple escalation graph, and these would be all the different ways that you could generate oxytocin. And arguably, they become more potent the further we go. That's not necessarily true. It's very possible for this one to maybe be bigger than this one, but I find that they typically go like this. And they all start here, this one here, which is conversation. Good conversation generates oxytocin. This is the kind of oxytocin you get from a really good friend. You want to sit, you want to talk, you want to gossip, you want to laugh, you want to joke. That is where great conversation comes from. Now, believe it or not, gossip, they believe, many scientists believe, is one of the originators of the reason we have human language. And so there's a really good book on this by Robin Dunbar, which I think is Gossip, Grooming, and the Evolution of Language, I think is what it's called. Anyway, the book breaks down how gossip might be the necessary reason for language. And it's all to do with something called freeloaders. The idea is that in society, we want to observe the people that aren't really communicating with the group or aren't really helping. And it's all well and good if there's only 7 people hanging out, but when humans grew to millions of people, it became very important for us to identify the people that are maybe against our tribe or the people that aren't really trying to help us or not contributing. And the only way to identify those people is to talk. So that's like one of the main keys. And there's a lot of arguments for this to do with monkeys and their habitats, which we'll break into when we deal with the second point, which is touching. When you touch somebody, when you massage them, it feels good. Massaging releases oxytocin. And if you ever see small groups of monkeys hanging out, you see them constantly picking little bugs out of their fur and scratching them and popping zits and doing all that good stuff. That is actually how monkeys bond. That's their form of oxytocin building. And what happens is, the idea is simple. If monkey A is popping the zits on monkey B's back, and so it's now monkey B's turn to do monkey A's turn, and then a tiger is going to come and eat monkey B. Monkey A's like, monkey B, watch out, you're going to rub my back tomorrow. There's a tiger behind you, right? So monkey A is going to help monkey B survive because he wants the return on investment. And so that's kind of like the original part of oxytocin building. And so I was talking about freeloaders earlier. If monkey B just went around receiving massages from everybody and never really gave anybody a massage, when one of the monkeys was going to get eaten by a tiger, monkey B is going to be like, oh, I kind of owe him a massage. Like, if he gets eaten, then that's what right? And so you don't want those people in your group. You want them gone. It's literally about survival. And so there's an argument that conversation developed as a means for us to identify people in the group, but faster. Rather than going and spending an hour massaging each monkey, it was a lot better for us to have a conversation with a group of people and be like, hey, did they ever do that favor for you that they were supposed to do? They didn't? I can't believe it. And that's why that is a natural part of our evolution. Now, how many people here think you're not a gossip? Raise your hand if you think you are not a gossip. Raise your hand, be honest. I love it, you're not a gossip, right? But you like movies. You like stories, right? Because stories are gossip. You're looking at the drama in someone else's life and captivated by it. If there was no drama, you wouldn't care. In fact, human beings are hardwired to love gossip. So even if you're like, I don't like gossip, I like staying out of it, it's actually a natural part of it, stories. We want to see what's going on. The story of like Star Wars is coming out soon, right? The new Star Wars, and the story of like Luke and Leia, but like they were brother and sister, and they were intimate. I mean, that's an incest story. I mean, it literally could be like a trailer trash drama, right? It could be, but because it's in space, it doesn't count, right? And that's my point. So we love stories. Stories are a big part of this because we like gossip. And arguably, many scientists, and I personally agree with this, it's because conversation triggers oxytocin more efficiently, but not as much. I would much rather you gave me a 1-hour massage than you chatted to me for 5 minutes, but I'll take a chat for 5 minutes over nothing. Okay? All right, so what comes next? So next is actually laughter. Now, I've got to be completely honest with you. I find that these two are kind of interchangeable. I often put laughter before touch, I think that laughter is a little bit easier to get into if we're naturally going through it. But you'll often find the most successful people when it comes to dating or love are funny. And you'll see this often when you see comedians. You'll see like the biggest comedians are always with like beautiful people. You're like, how is that possible? And it's because laughter is such a huge trigger of oxytocin. And so like I said, like, you know, we've got the early touches, which is like high fives or a gentle hug, compared with full-on belly laughs for hours and hours and hours. Or it can go the other way around, where you can have a good conversation, there's a lot of laughter, compared to massaging. So it just depends. They're kind of like in the middle, and I switch them depending on how I feel on the day. But I think there's a good argument that laughter is a very powerful trigger of oxytocin. And again, you can monitor it. You know, good laughter really does make you bond. Given a choice between hanging out with somebody that doesn't make you laugh and somebody that does make you laugh, you're probably going to pick the person that makes you laugh every single time. So we know that laughter is a good trigger, and this is very important. It definitely triggers it in you, but the person that makes you laugh doesn't necessarily get the oxytocin. So the person telling the joke doesn't necessarily feel the oxytocin, it's the people that are laughing. And I go into a sad note right now. You know that often some of the funniest people in the world are the ones that suffer from depression, the ones that commit suicide. You know, Robin Williams, of course, was terribly sad when that happened. Well, think about it. He spent most of his life making other people laugh, generating oxytocin in them, making them feel better. What was he really looking for? Somebody to make him laugh. He wanted the oxytocin, and that's why he knew it was so important to give other people that feeling, because it makes them feel bonded, makes them feel better. And so laughter is huge. And then, of course, the last one. You guys want to guess? What is it? That's the one. Sex is one of the biggest bonds that comes to releasing oxytocin. Now, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial and yet so brave when it comes to sex, and that is, I've seen a number of studies that have been done into this, and they state that women will almost always experience oxytocin during sex, but that biologically gendered men may not always experience it. Now, I've also seen studies that disagree with that, so it goes both ways. I just want to bring up the fact that this is a point of contention for some people. However, I've found that ultimately, when I am physically intimate with somebody, I definitely experience the feelings of oxytocin. And as a male, I feel that that's definitely a factor that's worth considering. But the point is, sex triggers oxytocin in us. It makes us feel bonded, usually on both parties. So if you look at a typical relationship, the decline of sex in the relationship almost always means the end of the relationship. And it's fascinating to me how many people believe that sex isn't important in their relationship. And yet I've never seen it not lead to a decline. And so I want to give an example of this. I actually had a student once. It was one of my lady clients, and she came to me and said, you know what, I'm refusing to have sex with my man because I'm gonna teach him a lesson. And I was like, the only lesson you're teaching him is that you don't want to be bonded with him. And the damage that will cause in the relationship will be monumental, like this will end. Fast forward about a month, she refused to listen to my point, and he cheated on her. And she said, I can't believe he cheated on me. And I was like, well, you took away the bond, and he wanted it, and so he got it with somebody else. And she's like, I just can't believe it, so what should I have done? I was like, look, I'm not saying you should sleep with him to keep him. I'm just saying that without a bond, without a tight oxytocin bond, there's going to be a problem. And so you can build it in other ways. Good conversation, touch, and laughter would build that bond and help if you really didn't want to have sex. But that is a great way to connect with somebody. And if you love this person, you should want it as much as them, and using it as a punishment tool is dangerous for your relationship. So they resolved it, they sat down and they worked it out. They started having this every single day. Guess what happened? Suddenly he didn't want to cheat anymore. He was so tired from the amount of sex that they were having, he didn't want to go anywhere else. And he said to her, like she said to him, she's like, look, you want to go anywhere else? He's like, no. He's like, I don't even want to move. And their relationship, they ended up being super tight because they had this bond, this really tight bond. And then they started working everything else out in the relationship. And she started illustrating the things that he was doing that were upsetting her. And he suddenly wanted to fix it because he's got a bond with her and he cared about what she thought. And the whole thing started turning around. So when it comes to attraction, if we're talking just purely from a chemical standpoint, if we want to build an oxytocin connection in somebody, it's very simple. We just follow this simple route. When you first meet somebody, you need to have good conversation. Now, this is very important. It's got to be good conversation from them and for you. If only they are having a good conversation, then they're going to enjoy it and they're going to build oxytocin, but you won't care about them. And if only you are having a good conversation, you won't care about them. They won't care about you. It will just be you that cares about the situation. So when we first meet, the topic of conversation dictates how good it is. Do you guys know what everyone's favorite conversation is? Do you guys want to guess? Everyone's favorite conversation is? Themselves. Everyone loves themselves. Everyone only wants to talk about themselves. Your favorite topics, your favorite topics are the things you care about. You want to talk about yourself. That means the other person wants to talk about themselves. So the easiest way to have a good conversation is talk about something that they care about and relate to it. So when I first meet people, I'll almost always say to them, one of my favorite techniques I'll give this to is I'll say to somebody, hey, so what's your big plan? Like 5 years from now, where do you see yourself? Everyone has a dream plan that they want to happen in 5 years. And if they're like, well, I don't know, I might still just be exactly where I am. I go, I totally get that, but where would you be if you could? Like, where would you want to be? And as I said that, by the way, everyone in the room smiled, right? Because you all know, like, oh, I know, I wish I was there in 5 years. So, and the fact you all smiled, by the way, right? I'm tripping it, and that's what I'm after. I want you to smile. You're gonna smile about your future plan. You're gonna appreciate it, and the more I get you to talk about it, the more you're gonna have great conversation, which is what I'm after. And then all I have to do is bond on that. So if you say that the thing you're really looking forward to is in the next 5 years, you're gonna buy a boat and sail around the Caribbean, then I've got to be like, you know what's funny? I went on a boat around the Caribbean literally last year. It was one of the most amazing experiences. Now, I know I'm gonna like this conversation because I'm talking about my vacation in the Caribbean. I know they're gonna like this conversation because they have a dream to sail around the Caribbean. We just hit on a topic we both care about. It's good conversation equals oxytocin. Now all I have to do is make sure I get touch in. And touch is awkward. We live in an age of consent. It's a time where everyone's nervous about touching other people. And I found the best way to trigger touch with somebody is invite them to touch you. So rather than me going up to people and just grabbing them, I'll often get an invitation. So one of the first things I say when I meet somebody is, hey, nice to meet you. A handshake, high five, any of these things, or just a polite wave. And so I'll give them the options of what they might want to do. If someone doesn't want to be touched, they're like, oh, polite wave would be great. And I know that I'm appealing to what they like. Now, while I'm not triggering touch, I did just have a good conversation, which still gives me my oxytocin. On the other hand, if someone's like, yeah, handshake's absolutely great, we go, cool. Or they might say, I'm a hugger, is that okay? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm essentially giving them the opportunity to choose how they wish to physically interact with me. And I'm trying to open it up and give a sequence. I'm like, which one do you want? And so they tell me. Now, because they're dictating it, they're gonna be much more open to it. The flow of oxytocin is gonna be thick and fast. They're gonna enjoy that oxytocin that's built up in them, and I'm gonna enjoy it in me. And so we go into the second phase. So now I've achieved oxytocin in these 2 points. I'm gonna try and maintain it as long as possible, and then of course, I'm gonna look for this. I want to make them laugh. Now, a lot of people will say, I'm not funny. I don't know how to make people laugh. It's very difficult. And it can be. So I want to tell you how I went about learning how to be quite funny. I'm not the funniest person in the world. I don't think I would ever do a career in stand-up. But I once did an entire stand-up comedy circuit just to prove that I could be funny. I came second in a competition back when I was like 19 years old. And I just wanted to learn what it means to be funny. And I found that actually the best way to be funny, especially if you're not a professional stand-up comedian, is to memorize jokes from stand-up comedians. And I found nothing is better. Now, the cool thing is, don't pretend that you're the expert. One of my favorite ways to do it is just like, hey, I was watching Comedy Central last night and I saw this comedian, he said this amazing joke. I'm bad at telling jokes, but do you mind if I try it? And then they'll say, oh yeah, no, sure, no problem, go for it. And then you can tell the joke. Doesn't matter if you mess it up, doesn't matter if you get it wrong, but as long as you pick a funny one and it's like people appropriate, everyone laughs, you've had a good time, they've had a good time, and everything's absolutely okay. And so I literally have a bunch of really bad jokes that I'll just randomly throw out and see if somebody finds them funny. And if they laugh, I know that I'm doing good, and I know that that's somewhere I'm going. And that's what you want. You want to be able to build up that oxytocin in somebody and have them absolutely laughing, belly laughing, right? And that is actually what you're after. And so now you build up that laughter. And the more you build that, the better it is. So actually, when I'm in a relationship with somebody, I measure the success of my relationship on whether I can make them laugh multiple times a day. And I'll look at that and I'll use it. And so what happens is once someone's laughing a lot, you're really looking for them to start touching you and them to start triggering good conversation in you. A lot of people here will go, okay, well, we go 1, 2, 3, can we jump into bed together? I'm like, you really don't want to do that. We need the oxytocin buildup in ourselves as well. If you try and rush it or just get it one-sided, and I've seen this a lot with my really successful students, they'll come and learn this, and they'll be like, oh, I'll just trigger oxytocin in everyone, I won't build it in myself. They're very depressed. They hang out with people that are obsessed with them, that love them so much, and they don't feel anything. And in fact, that happened to me many years ago when I first started getting good at dating. I was voted the #1 dating coach in the world. I would go to bars. I literally had the ability to walk up to almost anybody in the bar and get them to want to go on a date with me. It was crazy. It was so good, I would demonstrate it. People would come up there and be like, anyone? I was like, pick someone. And they'd be like, that person. I'd walk over to them, get talking to them. The next thing you know, we're like flirting. They give me their phone number and trying to make out with me. And these people would be like, you're so talented. And I was depressed. I would sit in the corner like just lonely and sad. I remember one time I was in London in a nightclub and I literally rocked up, brought my jacket with me, hung out with all my friends, curled up in a corner and fell asleep like under a table because I just didn't want to talk to anybody. I was going out because I should meet somebody, because I was single and I didn't meet anyone I liked, but it was because I could literally just generate oxytocin in almost anyone I met, but I didn't feel it. So I made myself a deal. The next person I met, I would only focus on oxytocin in me. What happened? I ended up falling madly in love with them. I dated that person for years because I built the oxytocin in myself. So I would never recommend that you go boom, 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 boom. I would recommend that you build up the first 3 and then allow them to build it in you and sit here for a while, enjoy this. Let the oxytocin build, get to know who they are. See if there's someone you genuinely like. And there is an argument that you can absolutely be intimate on a first date, and there is also an argument that you take your time until you're absolutely ready for it. But I would just enjoy building up oxytocin because once you cross this line, this is all that's left. And you want to be able to maintain all this other stuff throughout the entire relationship anyway. I meet so many people that are like, oh, I really just want to get laid, or I just want to have sex or what have you. I'm like, okay, great. What are you going to do for the other 23 hours and 45 minutes of the day with this person? Because the average sex that anybody will ever have is about 15 minutes a time. So when the goal is just 15 minutes of occupied time, you do need a plan for the other 23 hours and 45 minutes. Like there's something else you've got to do, and it comes from this other stuff. If you have 8 hours of work and 8 hours of sleep, that takes up 16 hours, but you've still got about 7 hours that need to be occupied. And those 7 hours with your partner need to be these other things. So in fact, when people come to me and say, oh, you're a dating coach, how do I learn to get better at dating? I actually teach them this, and I say, I'd really like you to focus on learning good conversation, learning how to touch people appropriately in a way that they want to be touched, and then lastly, getting them to laugh, being interesting and funny, and being able to hold down those conversations. And I find that if I can teach anybody these 3 things, then this kind of just happens naturally. This just is one of those things. When you spend all your time with somebody and that person really enjoys being with you and they're constantly laughing and constantly touching you, they want that last one to happen. And so it happens on its own. And this, I've found, is the best way to define exactly what love is in a way that people can understand and relate to it. And you can look at your past relationships that are a success, look at the past relationships that are failed dates, and you can probably see it. Would you guys agree you can see that there? And so this is what I would call the plan, the breakdown of love, and exactly what you need to be doing. Thank you.